Thank you for the presentation, for the invitation. Thank you for having me, and thank you to be here so numerous. So, when we start to think about Berio and technology, it quickly becomes clear that we cannot confine ourselves to his electronic works alone. Rather, we are led to engage with his entire body of music, even those works not connected to electronic media or electronic instruments. Electroacoustic experimentation and the encounter with technology had, in fact, a profound impact not only on his musical thoughts, but also on his very conception of composition. If we look at Berio's biography, we can observe the evolution of an artist who grew up within an horizon of great technological innovation. He was born in October 1925, only 11 months after the inauguration of radio broadcasting in Italy. He secured his first permanent position within that very institution, the RAI, Radio Televisione Italiana, precisely in the years of the launch of television broadcasting in 1954. Together with Bruno Maderna, he founded, again within RAI, one of the very first electronic music studios in the world, the Studio di Fonologia in Milan. Throughout his life, he followed and actively experimented with technological innovations that continually reshaped his conception of sound and space. From his early works for magnetic tape in 1950s to the compositions with live electronics written at the turn of the new millennium. In music history books, Berio is often described as one of the fathers of electronic music. The definition is undisputable, yet it remains limiting. What most clearly characterizes his relationship with technology is the profound influence that technology exerted on the entirety of his musical output, including works not conceived or intended within a technological or electronic framework. It is precisely the observation and analysis of this influence that offers the most illuminating perspective from which to speak about Berio's engagement with technology. Let us keep in mind a fact that is fundamental to Berio's biography. The years between the founding of the Studio di Fonologia and the peak of its golden period, that is from the late 1954 to 1961, were the most crucial for his musical development. In a way quite different from other composers of the time, such as Boulez, Maderna, Nono, or Stockhausen, Berio truly became Berio not in Darmstadt or elsewhere, but in the electronic studio. It was there that he acquired both the conceptual and practical awareness that would enable him to become the great composer we recognize today, thanks also to the technological tools at his disposal. To give some context, it is important to recall that in 1950s, the main areas of avant-garde compositional experimentation were essentially serialism, aleatory procedures, and electronic music. Among these, it was above all the electronic experience that had the most profound implications for young composers of the time, on both a technical, conceptual, and an aesthetic level. In the space of only a few years, working with the new tools, such as tapes, filters, sensors, proved revolutionary. Technology imperiously imposed its own rules and mechanisms. In 1975, recalling his first experience in the electronic studio, Berio remarked that, I quote, "The presence of tape unleashed a completely new vision of the possibilities of music and changed forever the very ideas of duration, timbre, density, space, and quotation. In the electronic studio, the composer takes on the role of a true artisan, able to intervene directly in the material creation of sound. The technology available in the studio allows him to compose his work in the broadest sense of the term, from the most elementary level of sound production to its manipulation, to its temporal unfolding and its projection into space. The complexity and hands-on skills required by these procedures demanded a careful evaluation of their use in relation to the desired outcome. Yet they often led to unexpected and surprising sonic results, which were then consciously re-employed as genuine creative mechanisms in subsequent works. It was precisely this openness to being surprised, to developing sonic possibilities not rigidly planned but suggested by direct work with technological tools, that distinguished the Milan studio from that of Cologne in the early phase of electronic music. In the German laboratory, composers such as Stockhausen adopted an approach grounded in the rigorous pre-design of electronic sound production. At the Studio di Fonologia, by contrast, Luciano Berio and Bruno Maderna choose from the very beginning to intertwine compositional rigor with a practice we might call intuitive, a practice based on continuous experimentation, which made it possible to conceive each piece in close relation, in close connection with the technical operations required for its realization, verifying step by step the resulting sound. I'm speaking of electronic music, and it may be useful to clarify a point that I consider fundamental. When the expression electronic music is used, one tends to associate it with a particular mode of composing. We imagine a composer who, with the assistance of a technician, generates sound material electronically, constructing structure that progress from the most elementary level, so the single pitch, to the most complex, that of the form. Beyond this immediate association, however, the processes through which the generated material was transformed into music remain far less clearly understood. Turning our attention to the Milan studio, for example, it becomes essential to recognize certain specific features that made that laboratory a truly distinctive experimental workshop when compared with other electronic studios at the time. It is well known, for example, that the instrument which distinguished the Studio di Fonologia from any other studio in the world was the panel with its 9 oscillators. Much has been said about this instrument, yet only recently has attention begun to focus on an aspect that had previously been entirely overlooked: the fact that the oscillators were each tuned differently from one another. In this slide, we see Marino Zuccheri, the technician of the Studio di Fonologia, playing one oscillator. Note, please, his hand resting on a knob marked with positions ranging from 1 to 6. From a musical standpoint, this seemingly minor detail proves to be of considerable interest. As instruments of precision, originally not conceived for musical purpose, the oscillators were calibrated to specific frequency ranges, covering a spectrum from 0,0010 Hz to 1 MHz. When, in 1956, The 9 oscillators were assembled in the studio di fonologia by RAI engineer Alfredo Lietti. Each was adjusted to fixed frequency bands in order to achieve optimal performance in terms of stability. Shown in this slide is an early calibration chart set on fixed values prepared by Alfredo Lietti. As you can see, the chart summarizes all the frequencies that could be generated by each of the 9 oscillators, which in turn could be set on 6 different frequencies. These rigid frequency ratios were later modified by Berio, resulting in a new configuration that was far more flexible and grounded in explicitly musical logics. The data for this reconfiguration would be unknown to us today, were it not for a drawing made by John Cage in 1958 during his stay at the studio in Milan, executed with almost obsessive precision. We have to remember that Cage composed Fontana Mix at that time at the studio di fonologia. In this drawing, Cage records all the frequency ratios that could be generated by the 9 oscillators, with the sole exception of the 8th oscillators, for which no information is provided. This omission, however, can be partially filled thanks to other documents, among them a letter to Henri Pousser in 1957, in preparation for his arrival at the studio di fonologia, where he would realize the electronic work Scambi. If we summarize this data in a table, we obtain the synthesis shown in this slide. Of course, it may be difficult to translate frequency ratios into specific pitches in real time. I therefore translate the numbers frequencies into notes and then place them on a traditional musical staves. In this way, we arrive at a key piece of information regarding the conceptual framework developed by Berio at the Milan studio. Together with Maderna, he approached the new technological tools on the basis of experience already acquired in traditional composing, adapting industrial device with standard frequency ranges by analogy with real music instruments. We may imagine each oscillator as it were a string of an instrument. Each one is tuned to different tones and capable of generating a minimum and a maximum range of pitches. If we look closely at the extension of each oscillator, the criterion appears to be orchestral. The 9 oscillators provide the composer with the entire range of instrumental registers. From the 1st to the 8th oscillator, the span runs from tuba to piccolo, while the 9th oscillator corresponds to the piano. Even the intervallic relationships point back to familiar models for a musician trained in traditional practice. This demonstrates how the technological instrument, even before influencing composers, was itself initially subjected to conditioning that was anything but neutral. To speak of the impact of electronics on instrumental music, therefore, also means reflecting on the implicit complicity established between the composer and the machine. It is true that technology transformed the composer's conceptual horizon, but it's equally true that the composer actively contributed to laying the very foundations of that transformation. But let us return to the studio and to its frequency generators. As it well known, there were 2 possible ways to construct sound: through additive synthesis, so that is by summing different elementary oscillations until obtaining a complex sound, or through subtractive operations. So subtractive synthesis, so starting with a white noise generator and arriving by means of successive filtering operations at simpler sounds. The filters were among the essential tools of a studio, and they came in various types: octave filters, third octave filters, low pass, side pass, and so on. The sounds generated and modified through different filters were then further composed and transformed using additional modulation devices. Complex timbre were created thanks to successive recording stages and to manipulation of the sonic result with various modulators, amplitude modulators, frequency modulators, ring modulators, and many others. Still further possibilities were provided by echo chambers, pulse generators, multi-track state recorder, power amplifiers, variable speed controls, and so forth. Among all the technological devices at the Studio di Fonologia, one deserves special mention: the tempophone, the time transporter machine with which Berio often experimented on the very limits of perceptibility of the electronically generated sound material. It was also thanks to these tools that Berio developed a profound sensitivity to the transformative potential of a sonic material, conceived and generated to be developed and transformed in speed and density within the compositional process. After the various phases of sound production and variation, the resulting material recorded on tape was finally organized through a patient process of editing. Composition thus emerged as a gradual process of formation, Berio said, formare la forma, consisting of a series of manual operations: mixing, cutting, splicing, assembling, and synchronizing, each step continually evaluated and decided upon through direct listening. You may imagine this compositional procedure as a kind of loop: generate, select, record, transform, listen, modify, rewrite, re-listen, re-record, retransform, and so on. From the very beginning, Berio seems to have grasped the enormous potential of this new mode of composition to enrich instrumental and vocal practice. Unlike many composers of his time, Berio was never swept away by that kind of electronic fever that overtook so many of his colleagues. As he remarked at the end of 1916, the invention of a new instrument makes no sense and is not possible. Electronic music is a new fact in the evolution of instruments. However, when it is conceived as a new instrument for generating new sounds, it is destined to fail. Even with electronic music, sound carries with it its own structural, social, aesthetic, and intellectual history. A conviction that resurfaces in several writings, including those of the 80s, when digital technology had supplanted analog. Work in the studio also offered Berio a way to confront and resolve compositional problems left unresolved by serialism. Contrary to what is sometimes written, for Berio, the electronic experience did not mean dismissing or moving beyond serialism. On the contrary, it came to reinterpret it by combining the ideal of equality, rigor, and coherence, so characteristic of serialism, with the freedom offered by electronic tools. For those not familiar with Berio's electronic output, it should be noted that pure electronic music, so produced exclusively with synthesized sounds, engaged him only for a very brief period. What little he produced in this field can be regarded as a kind of study or exercise, a way to gain familiarity with new technological tools. These were preliminary works whose fruits would emerge in later electroacoustic composition, or even in his purely vocal instrumental works. Already by 1955, Berio was using the term electronic music in a broad sense, referring to a global acoustic phenomenon that did not distinguish between pure or concrete elements, that is, between synthesized and or human, instrumental, or natural sounds processed electronically. By electronic, he meant a compositional attitude, not the sonic nature of the event itself. In this slide, perhaps, this slide, okay, I have summarized the works for and with electronic music realized by Berio between 1953 and 1975. Here I limit myself to his analog production. Almost all of these works were produced at the Studio di Fonologia, and the only pure electronic pieces are three: Mutazioni, Perspective, and Momenti. The first two titles, Mi Musik and Ritratto di Città, should be understood as experiments carried out before the foundation of the Studio di Fonologia. Ritratto di Città is the, we can understand Ritratto di Città as the milestone in order to found the Studio di Fonologia. Berio's first real electronic compositions are Mutazioni, Perspectives, and Tema Omaggio a Joyce, works which represent, as he said, three stages of a gradual increase in the complexity of thought. The first, Mutazioni, was realized when the studio still had only rudimentary equipment, and it can be seen as a transposition of the same compositional exploration that Berio had carried out in works like Nones or the first Alleluia, just to some sound of Mutazioni. So it's just to have an idea of this sound. Light here seems to separate this work from Perspectives, where Berio experimented for the first time with a particular technique of sonic development aimed to achieving continuity through the progressive acceleration of short, discontinuous elements. Perhaps the most important aspect of Perspectives, also in terms of its implication for later works, is that here Berio starts to articulate sonic materials in analogy with families of phonetic sounds. Indeed, all of the sounds in Perspectives can be classified phonologically and grouped into one of the fundamental consonantal families: sibilants, fricatives, plosives, and so on. So also in this case, just to have an idea of the piece. So it's just one ear difference, but it's really another world. It is within the context of these experiments that we find some of the discoveries Berio made in the studio as he explored the possibility of achieving, through electronics tools, gradual transitions from one sonic category to another. These last words are taken from a letter to Dalla Piccola, written in December 1957, in which he reports with great enthusiasm. I'm working on a piece for 4 instruments and recorded parts of instrumental sounds. That's the first idea of difference. In this context, I've made a sensational discovery that will finally make it possible to create a true musical connection, a continuity between instruments and electronic sounds, even between the human voice and electronic sounds. In this context, I'm currently running some experiments with the beginning of the Sirens chapter of Joyce's Ulysses. The voice becomes music, and the music becomes word. It's wonderful. In just a few lines, Berio sums up the research he was carrying out on difference, ultimately written for 5 instruments, not for 4, and on Tema, Omaggio a Joyce, works that would lead organically to his last composition completed at the studio before moving to the United States, Visage. As in difference, in Tema, no use is made of synthesized sounds, but only electronic transformations of concrete sounds. In difference, it was the sounds of the 5 instruments that were pre-recorded and modified by electronic means. In Tema, by contrast, it is Katy Berberian's voice that assumes the role of a 10th oscillator, while the role of sound generator is taken on by her reading on the 11th chapter of Joyce's Ulysses. The focus of Tema lies in the attempt to create continuity between sound and meaning through a gradual transition from modes of perception typical of a language to modes of musical perception. This exploration would become central to Berio's compositional horizon, leading him in those same years to declare that, I quote, "Electronic music is the only musical practice that really allows one to compose with different types of realities," end of quote. Thus, work in the studio set in motion a kind of research aimed in creating an endless network of relationship among distant sonic experience, establishing contact between different musical dimensions and giving them a meaning other than their original one, independently of whether the materials were drawn for high culture or from popular music. At this point, I would like to let you hear a series of sound examples in sequence. The first dates from 1954 and is taken from the already mentioned radio documentary that marked the birth of the studio di fonologia Ritratto di Città. We will listen to a short excerpt related with the awakening of the city. We are in 1954.
Ruote e ambizioni preparano nel cuore dell'ingranaggio l'esaltato clamore della nuova giornata.
It's a kind of description of the city. The city is awakening and there are The second example comes from a tape recorded by Berio in 1956 for an internal audition at RAI. In this audio document, Berio reads a long text, accompanying his words with a number of electronic or electronically transformed sound examples. Among them is the following.
And we one there, and he says, "Oh, why did you do that? Why did you do that?" And so I said,
The voice became music. From the text read on this tape, Berio derived the essay entitled Perspettive in musica, ricerche e attività allo studio di fonologia musicale della Radio di Milano, so Perspective in Music, Research and Activities of the Studio di Fonologia Musicale of Radio Milan, published that same year in an issue of the journal Elettronica. Enclosed with the journal was a record that contained several sound examples illustrating Berio's text. Let us listen to the first track, which exemplifies what Berio himself described as, I quote, more or less primitive manifestations of spontaneous music, in which the word directly influences the sonic event.
Ito. Boko kawa olondo. Mbole. Kundali kalengeli boke.
And finally, we come to the fourth and last example, taken from a radio documentary produced by Berio and Umberto Eco in 1958, Omaggio a Joyce, documenti sulla qualità onomatopeica del linguaggio poetico. So Omaggio a Joyce documents on the onomatopoeic quality of poetic language. In fact, the direct antecedent of Tema Omaggio a Joyce, so the composition Tema Omaggio a Joyce is a part of this documentary, is a musically elaborated part of this documentary. In a play of sonic onomatopoeias achieved through electronic processing, all the earlier examples resurface.
Africa.
Ito.
La voce di un negro. Ed ecco rispondere con la stessa cadenza il suono dei tamburi.
Mbole. Kundali kalengeli boke.
America. E i richiami degli indiani d'America, cui corrispondono perfettamente i canti degli uccelli. E poi ancora, America. Il canto degli uccelli nella voce degli indiani diviene ora il rumore delle nuove macchine, istinto irrefrenabile dell'onomatopea. E a New York, di mattina, la frase di una donna negra colta di sorpresa, una voce abituale, qualsiasi. E ad essa risponde ancora perfettamente la voce di una tromba, una frase, gli stessi suoni.
and he says, "Oh, why did you do that? Why did you do that?" And so I said,
So it goes without saying that in this context, to speak of quotation or collage or similar terms is not only reductive, but, in my view, mistaken. Just as it is, in my opinion, when such terms are applied to works like coro, sinfonia, voci, and others. There is indeed montage, but it is guided by a precise intention to create perceptual and mental associations that unfold, as Berio himself put it, I quote, from the simple to the complex, from sound to noise, from models of nature to sonic models fabricated in the studio, from the voice to the instrument, end quote. This aspect also points directly to another characteristic of the work in the studio, The sonic materials fixed on tape, whether preliminary sketches or even completed works, were often conceived as partial materials, potentially subject to reworking, transformation, or reprise in identical or modified form. In the studio, the very concept of the finished work comes into tension with the endless permutational and re-elaborative possibilities offered by technological tools and by the very quality of the sonic material. Each work, each finished product could be at once a point of arrival and a point of departure for a new transformations. It is perhaps from this perspective that we should understand certain operations often described as quotation or montage in various works, where he witnessed the reuse of previously composed materials. So consider, for example, Epiphany, in which Berio recomposed quaderni, the first, the second, and the third, or the harmonic rereading of the sequence in the different chemin, or for earlier works revisited after several years, so Alleluia is one example, as is Epiphany. Or again, the migration of parts or even entire compositions from one work to another. Think, for example, of tempi concertati in opera or king in sinfonia, and so on. Many of Berio's work can also be understood as analogous to a magnetic tape, a whole consisting of the sum of interchangeable parts, which, especially through the experience of direct listening, as in the studio, can change order, be interpolated or varied until reaching an ideal form. You should bear in mind that from the late 50s onwards, there is no work by Berio that did not undergo more or less evident formal changes after its premiere. We had this experience in our workshop with this first version, second version, provisional version, definitive, etc., etc. As I move towards the conclusion of my talk, I would like to provide you with some concrete examples. The most evident influence that electronic music seems to have had on Berio's instrumental writing concerns the idea of sonic space and the very concept of spatialization. This topic immediately calls to mind Stockhausen and his Gruppen for 3 orchestras, composed between 1955 and 1957. This work, Gruppen, is often mentioned by scholars as the model that informed Berio's spatial conception in Alleluia, the second Alleluia, for 5 orchestral groups, completed in 1958. Yet, before the second Alleluia, Berio had already confronted the parameter of space in the first version of Alleluia, written between 1955 and 1956. Although conceived for a single orchestra, in the first Alleluia, the ensemble is in fact divided into 6 heterogeneous groups. The interplay between Berio's and Stockhausen's spatial experiments is interesting not so much for reasons of priority, but rather in the implicit involvement of electronic media in shaping this new aspect of the spatialized diffusion of sound in orchestral works. Stockhausen himself was surprised by the contemporaneity of the 2 explorations. Shortly before the premiere of the first Alleluia in Cologne, at the beginning of 1957, he wrote to Berio, "I'm glad that Alleluia is now finished. It is rather curious that your choice of instrumentation is very close to my piece for 3 orchestras. So I can sense that there is also a shared imagination. Did I read correctly? Were you working on Alleluia with me in mind?" This last question, did I read correctly, refers to an essay by Berio, Aspetti di artigianato formale, Aspects of Formal Craftsmanship, where he indeed discusses Alleluia, the first Alleluia, but the answer would seem to be no. He had not Stockhausen in mind. According to the documents available to us, the idea of spatialization in Alleluia, the first Alleluia, derives, in fact, directly from experiments carried out in the electronic studio on the control of the density of complex sound structures, so of sound groups, and their internal transformation. Stockhausen clearly did not read Berio's test carefully, also because the only time he is mentioned in it is not in connection with Gruppen, but rather in reference to an electronic work, Gesang der Junglinge. Considering that Gruppen was composed in parallel with Gesang der Junglinge, perhaps in this case it makes less sense to insist on issues of priority. It is more fruitful to emphasize the correspondence and the simultaneity between the emergence of the two practices of specialization and the common influence of electronic practice. Proceeding chronologically, a second concrete example involves Circle. We had the occasion to hear also live this composition, which directly stems from the experience of Tanna or Major Joyce. Like Tanna and like Visage, Circles responds to the need to achieve a constant interaction among different sonic situations, to realize gradual transitions between voice, sound, and music. The difference is that in Circles, the transformation between these different sonic situations is not achieved by electronic technology, but through the interaction of a female voice, at the time Katy Berberian herself, two percussion groups, and a harp. In Tanna, it was Joyce's text that provided the material. In Circles is now the poetry of Cummings that provides the material for generating vocal situations to be transformed, modulated, and filtered into the instrumental texture, according to the very same principle as electronic music. I would like to listen with you the two passages taken from Tanna and Circles. Tanna, this is the theme, so that provides the lecture made by the reading the text by Katy Berberian, and then the very beginning of the transformation with electronic tools, and then we also an example from Circles.
Each and for other plash and silent roar, pearls when she lists rhapsodies.
Yes.
A sail
So the sibilant S became
spiked, winding,
music.
cold, silent lists.
From this point, there is no voice, no real voice, but the voice is transformed electronically. And now with Circles, so I said there is no electronic at all. Voice, percussions, and harp. The S became the sound of percussion. And it's the same principle of the thing that Berio did with electronic tools in Tanna. turning now to aspects more closely tied to compositional practice, one of the clearest examples of the presence of electronic thought in the genesis of instrumental works is provided by the string quartet Synergies, written in 63-64, whose very title openly refers to procedures typical of the electronic studio, Synergies, synchronization. As is often the case with various works, the sketches are not numerous, but those that exist are rich in information. The diagram Berio outlines in this sketch immediately recalls procedures specific to electronic music. It is directly derived from the synoptic table that were compiled in the studio to define the characteristic points of departure and arrival for each parameter, or to establish the overall range of variation within discrete transformation values. In this case, we find 5 parameters of variation: timbre, so morphological, dynamics, frequency, tempo, or speed, and synchronization. 3 macro-regions of parameter articulation divide into minimum, medium, maximum, where each macro-region unfolds within 5 intermediate values, the 5 lines of the staff, and then 3 trajectories of the parameters, simultaneous or opposed, visualized by connecting the red dots and lines in the diagram. It emerged that the temporal parameters, synchronization and tempo, are always inversely proportional to the qualitative parameters of sound. In a subsequent sketch, the reflection of electronic practice becomes even more evident. Here we are faced with a multi-layer diagram of the entire composition. The development and the coordination of the 5 parameters, timbre, dynamics, frequency, tempo, and synchronization, are displayed in a diagram that summarizes the variation of the individual levels. As in the rigorous charts of electronic music, we can clearly see the continuous transition from one state of the material to another. This scheme established several points of contact between Synergies and the electronic work perspectives. Both compositions are studies on different degrees of acceleration and stratification of the material. In both, the more tempo is subject to acceleration, the shorter and more synchronized the accelerated elements become. In both perspective and Synergies, it is precisely the different degrees of temporal distribution that determine the formal evolution. The diagram also adds another layer of information, likewise visualized in a layered manner that reflects electronic thinking. The 3 trajectories from the previous scheme are now developed across 3 layers, the first, the second, and the third, to be understood as harmonic strata flowing simultaneously and distributed among the timbral voices of the string quartet. These strata are defined in their harmonic content by 12 letters from A to M. I cannot go in the analysis, but you can see the way in which Berio is referring to something is with letter. This letter refers to 12 sound aggregates traced in the earlier sketch. Now, without going into analytical detail, I would simply draw your attention to the fact that these 12 harmonic aggregates, so groups or chords, each consisting of 6 pitches, are derived from a prior operation of selection and filtering carried out by Berio on the basis of 2 sets or scales of sounds. I will now make a leap that might seem unrelated and show you one of the very few sketches existing for an electronic work by Berio Momenti. In this sketch, next to the number 1 that indicating the first oscillator, we see a sequence of numbers. These are frequencies. And then selections or concatenations of groups of numbers. So let us once again try to translate these numbers into sound. As we can see, the frequency scale marked by the number 1 consists of 24 pitches, 12 plus 12. From this scale, exactly as we saw in Synchronia, Berio generates 4 distinct harmonic aggregates by means of a precise system of intervallic filtering. This filtering process becomes clearer if we visualize Berio's selection in this way. And now, jumping forward 8 years, let us observe the pitch selection carried out by Berio for one of his masterpieces, Sinfonia, without electronics, orchestra, and voice. These compositional analogies that link Momenti, Synchronia, and Sinfonia, and also other works, are by sure not accidental. In 1968, the year of Sinfonia, the era of analog technologies was already giving way to digital ones, which would lead to the advent of live electronics and the possibility of generating or transforming sound in real time during performance. This would further enrich Berio's creative horizon. Around those years, Berio was asked whether, after the great flowering of the 1950s and 60s, electronic music could be considered dead. His response was unequivocal. Today, one speaks less about electronic music simply because some of its techniques, and above all, the very concept of electronic music, have become integral aspects of musical thought. To say that electronic music is dead is to misunderstand what this has meant and what it still means. It is to give excessive importance to certain technical operations while ignoring the significance of the musical processes they imply. The idea of electronic music is present in all the best contemporary instrumental music. End quote. For Berio, we can summarize. All music is technology, understood as the meeting of techne and logos, as the art of combining different techniques and of applying in its musical practice the full range of methods, insights, knowledge, all this developed within the electronic studio. Thank you.